Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our talk today. Today's lecture is sponsored by the Studio Potter Journal and the African American Archive of Columbia County. My name is Lisa Fludd-Smith. I am co-founder and deputy executive director of the African American Archive. Our mission is to forge a deeper understanding of the lived historical experience of Black people in the Hudson Valley. Our focus is specifically on Columbia County because our own ancestors were among the first Africans brought there by the Dutch patroons in the 1600s. And the story of their future in that area has basically been lost to time. So the goal of the archive is to create a museum and research center as a cornerstone for the study of Black history and genealogy. Our lectures, like the one you're attending today, give us both the opportunity to educate and to engage with the community of like-minded people. So we very much appreciate you being here today. We hope that you'll enjoy the talk. And that being said, let me do a little bit of housekeeping. And then we'll get started. First, I'd like to remind you all to please mute yourselves and stay muted for the duration so as not to distract from our presentation. We will have a Q&A period at the end of the talk, and I encourage you to use the chat function, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Put any questions that you have in the chat there, and I'll be monitoring the chat throughout. And I'll try to ask your questions in the order that they're put in. Also, do watch the chat yourselves because we periodically share links to things like our website or other information that might be shared during the talk. We are here also with Victoria Jimpson-Fludd of Studio Potter Journal. Vicki, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Lee. My name is Vicki Jimpson-Fludd. I'm the new executive director of Studio Potter, the Studio Potter Journal. For the past 50 years, Studio Potter has represented the multiplicity of contemporary and historical ceramics by publishing exceptional and thought-provoking content, strengthening and growing our community, connecting artists, educators, collectors, curators, gallerists, critics, historians, and learners through narratives, interviews, and critical essays. With this inauguration of the new online programming, Studio Potter hopes to cross-pollinate by co-partnering with communities which have shared interests, but which are not necessarily part of the clay community. In this inaugural program, which is co-sponsored, as you know, by the African American Archive, we bring to you a program on America's first Black pottery company owner, Thomas Commeraw. This year, much attention has been focused on Commeraw, from the Clay Community Studio Potter Advisory Board member, Mark Shapiro, was awarded a Smithsonian Artist Residency Fellowship to research Commeraw. In addition, he co-curated the recent New York Historical Society's exhibition, Crafting Freedom, the Life and Legacy of Free Black Potter Thomas W. Commeraw. Today, we are pleased to present another researcher, Brandt Zipp, who has researched Commeraw from another perspective, which has brought the pottery maker himself to light. I will let Lee go ahead and tell you more about this. Lee?
Thank you, Vicki. So as Vicki said, our speaker today is Brandt Zipp. Brandt is the author of a book called Commeraw's Stoneware, The Life and Work of the First African American Pottery Owner. And that book is the culmination of nearly 2 decades of researching Thomas Commeraw. It was Brandt's own serendipitous discovery of Commeraw's identity in 2003 that actually brought this story to the modern world. As a graduate of Johns Hopkins University, Brandt is a founding partner of Crocker Farm Incorporated, a Maryland-based auction house, nationally known for its high level of offerings of period American ceramics, as well as many important contributions to research in the field. So thank you very much, Brandt, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lee. Really appreciate it. I want to get started first by thanking the African American Archive of Columbia County, as well as Studio Potter for having me. This talk really kind of punctuates, as they mentioned, a great year for Thomas Commeraw. It's really gratifying to see his name in the national media on a regular basis now. This was someone you're going to see as I go. I kind of started from scratch with this whole thing, and I always hoped that he would start to attain some sort of a legendary status that I think he deserves. And so I hope that as you see this talk progress, you might agree with me. Anyway, let me share my screen here. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start this talk with two beautiful examples of Thomas Commeraw's work. In a sense, they're typical in that he became very well known for these very prominent maker's marks as his work started to be collected in the 20th century. Some potters in this time period didn't mark their work at all. Thomas Commeraw is perhaps the first American stoneware potter to actually mark his work and put his name on his work. Around the time Commeraw opened his shop is when you start to see these potters begin to mark their work, but Commeraw marked his work very prominently. The words Corlear's Hook you see there underneath Commeraw's stoneware, it's a strange phrase, but that is a neighborhood in Lower Manhattan. Corlear's Hook Park still exists as kind of a vestige of that small area that I'm going to talk about as we go. At the top of these jugs, you see the word N York. And that wasn't just a way for Thomas Commeraw to communicate to consumers that you could contact him in New York, that these were being made in New York. It was signaling something important to consumers because consumers understood New York City stoneware to be the gold standard of the craft. And so Commeraw was working in a place that was considered to be the best of the best as far as American stoneware goes, and he was one of only a handful of shop owners there. New York was also really the founding place of the American stoneware craft. It was founded by German immigrant potters who came to the city about 1720. This type of pottery, now I fully recognize there are people in the audience from the studio pottery world that know more about this than I do, but some of you probably have very little idea what this type of pottery actually was. This is called salt glazed stoneware. So this pottery was made by putting unglazed pots thrown out of stoneware clay into a kiln. And then at a certain temperature, salt would be introduced to the kiln. The salt would vaporize and it would bond with the surface of the clay and it would create essentially glass. And you get this wonderful glass-like coating on the ware. The blue you see is achieved using cobalt oxide, which was an expensive mineral at the time. But what you have here is an African-American potter who is perhaps only one generation removed from Africa, working in an old Germanic tradition that he was taught by Germanic potters. This type of pottery dates back to about the 15th century in Germany. When these potters come over, they start to make work that looks something like this. You can see that it's a lot cruder than the finer German pottery, which predates this piece. But this piece was probably made by a family called the Crolius family, and they were known perhaps as the most, I would say for sure, the most famous stoneware potting family in the United States during their time. They also happen to be the family that enslaved, but later freed Thomas Commeraw. Thomas Commeraw was born in 1771 or 72. He opens his shop in 1796 or 97. He leaves New York for the west coast of Africa in 1820. And he dies on August 15th, 1823. So he was about 25 years old when he opens his shop. He lived about 52 years. During that time, he lived an extremely remarkable life. He was not only one of the most prominent African-American craftsmen, his obituary described him as being very generally known throughout the city of New York by everyone. He did business with people up and down the Eastern Seaboard on a regular basis. His work is found as far away as Europe and South America. ultimately, Commeraw decides that he wants to attach himself to a project where he's going to try to found a West African republic founded on American ideals. What's remarkable is sometime between August 15th, 1823, and the turn of the 20th century, Thomas Commeraw was basically completely forgotten by American society. These are two early museum acquisitions of Thomas Commeraw's work. On the left, you have a piece that was purchased in 1918 by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. On the right, you have an oyster jar made by Commeraw for a fellow African-American oysterman, and that was acquired by the New York State Museum sometime prior to 1905. When these major institutions acquired this work, they had no idea who made it. Now, in 1907, this is an accession list from what became the Philadelphia Museum of Art. You see them acquiring a jar, a salt glazed stoneware jar, made by Commeraw. And it seems pretty apparent to me that at that time, these institutions really had no idea even what Commeraw's first name was. It's important to remember that Thomas Commeraw was making, Thomas Commeraw's work was being acquired by major institutions throughout the 20th century. So in some cases, we might find some historical data about a forgotten African-American craftsman or any craftsman. And we may have literally no signed work for this person, but still consider them to be important for various reasons, worth researching, all that. Commeraw left behind a large body of work, and it was being acquired by the highest level of American institutions for decades, really under the assumption that this was simply another white potter working in Manhattan. So here is a jug, a wonderful jug purchased by the New York Historical Society in 1937. This was acquired by the Brooklyn Museum in 1943. This jar was acquired by Winterthur. This bar is in my way here. I just want to move that so I can read these dates. There we go. Winterthur in 1959. This was acquired by the Smithsonian along with a large number of Commeraw's work in 1979, part of a large collection. This was acquired by the Fenimore Art Museum in 1989. In the 30s and 40s, there was an attempt to figure out who Thomas Commeraw was. And in a sense, it was a federally funded attempt to research Thomas Commeraw, because under a larger umbrella of something called the Index of American Design, which in turn was under the umbrella of the New Deal project known as the Works Progress Administration, which is just basically a way to employ artists and researchers and things like that in the wake of the New Deal. There was a massive project to document early American decorative arts and the artists that made them. So there are a fair number of watercolors. These two are two of my favorites that are housed at the National Gallery today. These people were painting Thomas Commeraw's work and they had no idea who he was, and people were researching him. But the farthest they got was digging into these books called city directories. Now, we don't even use phone books anymore, but really the best description of what a city directory is just to compare it to a phone book without telephone numbers. These were books that were ubiquitous. They were issued by all sorts of American cities on a regular basis. And the New York City ones were somewhat progressive in that some of these books in certain cities would actually note people's races. The New York City books did not. So when people looked in these books, trying to find who made the Commeraw stoneware objects, they did find a man named Thomas W. Commeraw, who was a potter in Corlier's Hook, sometimes listed on Cherry Street. But they had no idea of his background. Now, one thing that complicated all of this is that Thomas Commeragh's name is never spelled correctly in those city directories. Those directories listed something like all of the gainfully employed men in a city. They would sometimes put female business owners and widows and things like that. It was mostly men. And they were compiled simply by going from business to business, home to home. And these people never spelled his name correctly. So you have this name at the top, Commeraw. Now that's an important thing. I'll get to that in a minute. You have these other really badly mangled versions of his name, the worst being the one at the bottom, which is Lamoureux. Now, by the mid 20th century or so, a man came along named William Ketchum. And William Ketchum is very well known to stoneware collectors. He wrote several books on American stoneware as well as other decorative arts. And he wrote a book, actually there's two versions of this book. I put that down there at the bottom, 1970 and 1987. There are two versions that came out in those years. And those books are universally owned by anyone who studies this type of pottery, whether you're a museum, a collector, dealer, whatever, you have these books. In those books, he attempted to solve the problem of who had made these pieces. But he decided that spelling Commeraw that I showed you must be the correct spelling. And what that did was really kind of unintentionally spin into the public mind the idea of a potentially French potter, a white potter of French descent. Now you'll see here, he actually wrote in that book, he left behind a rather large number of salt glazed vessels bearing versions of the seal Commeraw Stoneware in New York. If you were a collector of this type of pottery, you would get very frustrated because those vessels do not exist. There are none that are stamped that way. They're all stamped Commeraw's stoneware. But just as someone who grew up with stoneware, it was just generally said that this potter's name was Thomas Commeraw. And it was just assumed that he was a white potter of French descent. Where I enter this story was in 2003 when I kind of accidentally discovered the truth about this potter whose work was in all of these institutions that was routinely sold for fairly like there was a strong market for this potter's work as far as New York City stoneware went because it was somewhat unusual. And it shocked me that this was the case. So I was researching a potter named Henry Remy. Henry Remy was a New York City potter, and he came to Baltimore in 1812 and completely transformed the American stoneware craft. He was a very important potter, and he's one of the most respected stoneware potters. This cooler, we sold this in an auction in 2015, and I usually try to keep values out of this. I try to keep scholarship and sales separate and all that, but just to understand that this pottery is beginning in the public mind to achieve something like the level of fine art. This actually, by Henry Remy, holds the world auction record for a piece of salt glazed stoneware at $483,000. Now, the world auction record for stoneware in general, which is something glazed with something called alkaline glaze, which I won't get into, and American pottery in general, was by the African-American potter David Drake, and that sold for $1.56 million. So these pots can be expensive. Not all of them are. Some of them have very little value. But anyway, and I'll talk a little bit about the value of Commeraw's work as I go. But as I was researching this potter, I decided I wanted to research his New York years because that was something that hadn't been done very thoroughly. And I came upon this census listing. Now, this was in the 1810 federal census. Every 10 years, America takes a census of its people. And the process for that has changed. The methods of it have changed. But in this year, they were taking all of the heads of household and they were noting certain data about their families. And I saw that this said Thomas Commeraw B. Now, I didn't know what B meant at that time, but I quickly ascertained it when you look at this, basically this sheet of paper. So you can see here that these columns up here are difficult to read, but up here, this says free white males under 10 years of age. Here's free white males of 10 and under 16. So you can go all the way through here and you can see this data about the constituencies of these households. So this guy here, Philip Schomburg, he had one little boy under 6 in his family, but that boy happened to be white. But when we look at this person, Thomas Commeraw, with the B after his name, which you're going to see means black, there are no white people in his family. There are, however, 6 free blacks, is what that says. Now, this is where racism really does enter the historical record, in that we could get a lot more information about this family if Commeraw happened to be white. And there are hints in the there's some obvious data about his family. He was married twice. His first wife died, and we'll get to that. I'm about to jump into Commeraw's story, so I'm sorry this might be taking a little too long. But anyway, and we know about how many children he had. He had at least 3 children, but there are hints that he had a much larger extended family. Well, we can't get any information about that from this census record. In 1800, this is spelled out even more clearly. Thomas Commeraw is a black. And, you know, I was shocked when I found this, because as I showed you, there was a long history of trying to research this potter, and never was this, you know, a thought in anyone's mind that this could be the case. In time, I managed to prove this was around the first of the year of 2003 when I found this. And it took me a few years to really hit any more pay dirt on him. But eventually I was kind of bowled over by the amount of information I found. One thing that confirmed that this was definitely the same man who was the potter is this really great 1819 internal city census that lists Thomas W. Commeraw as a potter baker. And that's just a cool colloquialism for a stoneware maker. And you can see here that he's listed as being colored. This TO is ditto. It's basically the equivalent of 2 hash marks. So what you have here is a potter who was, on the one hand, wholly, and hey, it's fitting that we're doing a talk here sponsored by both the African American Archive of Columbia County and Studio Potter, because on the one hand, you have a man who was wholly a working potter. He was everything that a New York City craftsman was. He was he lived that life in his politics. He was a patriotic person. He was a church-going man. You know, all of that stuff that you would expect a craftsman in a major American city to be at that time, he was. On the other hand, he was also entirely heavily engaged with making sure that he used his position to try to advance people of his own color, people who didn't have a lot of people necessarily advocating for him. Well, he was for them. He was an advocate for them. Thomas Commeraw, as I said, was born in 1771 or 72, possibly at the very site where this beautiful inkstand, which is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was made. This was made by Thomas Commeraw's enslaver. And it was made when Commeraw would have been a year or 2 old. Now, this man also is the person who freed Commeraw and his entire family. So this person, William Crolius is his name. He gets sick during the American Revolution. The family has retreated out of Manhattan because the British have occupied it, and they've gone to New Jersey. And he makes out his will, and you can probably barely read this, but what this says is, I do hereby fully manumit, set free and discharge my Negro slave Tom, with his wife Venus and children Tom, Phyllis, and Venus. Now, the first, there was, you know, Tom at the time was a very common name for slaves, and so there was no way to know for sure that this was the same person that went on to become a stoneware manufacturer in New York City named Thomas Commeraw, apart from a couple of really interesting records that I was really thrilled to turn up a long time ago. This is a marriage record for Thomas Commeraw and Mary Rowe. You can see there that they are listed as Negroes, and that they are being married in Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan on August 5th, 1792. Trinity Church was an important kind of hub for African Americans at the time in terms of education, Christianization, all of that. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. But we also see, just 13 days after Commeraw's marriage, we see a marriage of Venus Commeraw to this guy, Joseph Sharp. So you can see this is clearly the same family of enslaved people that William Crolius had enslaved and freed. As I said, Trinity really had for decades in the 18th century been educating people of African descent. This is a view of Trinity in 1790. This is the building Commeraw would have known. This was the building Commeraw was married in. The image on the left is of Alexander Hamilton. Now, Alexander Hamilton was Commeraw's co-parishioner there. He is buried in its churchyard. These services were apparently segregated. So in a sense, they were not co-parishioners. However, it's fascinating to me, given just the insane success of Hamilton and everything, to see how Commeraw was kind of in that story in a way. But it also had bearing on his life in that really the big organization in Manhattan sticking its neck out for people of African descent was something called the New York Manumission Society. And that was founded by Alexander Hamilton. It was also founded by John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, also a Trinity Church member. They also founded this thing called the African Free School. You see that on the right. So, and that was an important city institution to educate people of African descent for decades on end in the 19th century. And that was an outgrowth of what Trinity had been doing for decades in the 18th century. And my point with all this is that it's highly likely that Thomas Commeraw was in some way educated under the auspices of Trinity Church. You're going to see the place where Thomas Commeraw worked. So when he gets to be a young man, when he marries Mary Rowe and all that, he's working in a place here near modern City Hall Park. So there's down here is where City Hall Park would have been. This is where these stoneware shops were clustered. And Thomas Commeraw was making stoneware there that looked something like this. Now, these are extremely fine examples of this type of pottery. This type of pottery really took off around this time because Americans were starting to understand that its chief American-made competitor was earthenware, but that earthenware, which is fired at a lower temperature, was more fragile, but is also typically glazed with lead, and that is very bad for you. People began to understand that that was the case around this time. So stoneware solved a long-term food storage need that other types of pottery often didn't. You can see these are really beautiful examples. And when he strikes out on his own, which is in 1796 or 97, he moves over to this area. So he was here, now he's over here. This is on the Lower East Side. This is an image I took of a Commeraw pot outside where the pottery would have been. The door to the pottery would have been perhaps a few steps behind the pot. This is the place called Corlear's Hook. This was named after an early agent of the Dutch East India Company, and hook basically means point of land in Dutch. So this point of land here is where he planted his pottery. You can see Corlear's Hook Park is still there. Obviously, this is New York City today. This is what it looked like at the time. So you can see this is almost like a rural area where he's working. This place was, I saw one ad of the time that actually described Corlear's Hook as being near New York, as opposed to being in New York, which is crazy. But this was on the outskirts of the city for sure. This is one of my favorite views of the city from the time period. This is taken, I mean, this was painted shortly, right around the time Commeraw opened his shop, and the pottery would have been over here somewhere off to the left of our view. But you can see the waterfront community of which he was a part. Commeraw's earliest work does not have his name on it. It just says Corlear's Hook. And this was something that potters did at the time. You'll see pieces around this time just marked Boston, for instance. That's all they say is Boston. And that's what he was doing. He was just stamping it Corlear's Hook. And York, you can see how indebted this work is to the stuff he would have been making down with these white potters in near City Hall Park. This is a jug that was made. The jug on the right was made down there near City Hall Park. That's an extremely beautiful example. And it's the decoration you can see is so similar to a marked Commeraw pot that he may have decorated that piece when he was working there. That may be a rare case where we have a piece he made while he was still employed with these white potters who clearly also trained him. Now, one question is, why was Thomas Commeraw trained to be a stoneware potter? Well, at the time, you couldn't just free a slave in New Jersey and New York. You couldn't just free a slave and walk away from the situation. You had to basically take out an expensive bond to make sure that this person did not become a public charge, did not need support from the community. So it seems to me that that's the answer for why Thomas Commeraw was trained to be a stoneware potter, that this family that freed him was making sure that he was able to make a living. Here is, with that in mind, here is a Commeraw pot on the left, and next to it is one made in 1775 by the Corlear's family. But you can see this design here, how similar that is to this. So this would have been made when he was a small boy. This he makes in the mid to late 1790s. You can see how indebted his work is to the work of the Corlear's family. Now, this pot here, I chose it for the cover of my book because I thought that it's one of the most beautiful pieces of Manhattan stoneware of the time period. And Thomas Commeraw made it, and he kind of put to shame some of the work of other potters. He was so good at getting a beautiful color in his kiln, and you'll see that as we go. But this piece, I told you I'd touch briefly on values. This just broke the world auction record in our summer auction, and it brought $120,000. Let's see here. So here are typical jars that Commeraw would have been making in the 18th century. There are very few of these known. So I say typical, there's very few of them known. But clearly, given the number that are out there, which is a handful, this was his typical jar style for that time, usually. You also saw the one I just showed you, and I'm going to get to that in a second. You see these different, they call this incised decoration because you're cutting a decoration into the clay first with a tool, and then you're filling it in with glue. But this incised decoration is a hallmark of his early work. You see both this hanging flower and you see like this upswept thing sometimes. Here is a just surfaced pot that is one of the best Commeraw examples out there, and that decoration on the front is unique. I've never seen it on another example of his. You can see on the back it has a more typical design there based on the pots I just showed you. All of these early Corlear's Hook pieces that don't say Commeraw's name, they're one, extremely rare, but two, they are really the only pieces I've ever seen that I feel confident were made completely by Commeraw from top to bottom. The reason I say that is his work later is a little more of a hodgepodge of styles and things. And it looks to me like, and the historical record does show this, that he had other potters employed in the shop. So in a sense, it's irrelevant because it's still his manufactory, it's his production system, all those things. But early on, it seems that he's actually the man making all this stuff from top to bottom. And the reason I say that is the decorations all look like they're executed by the exact same hand. The pots even seem like they're thrown by the same person. there's just attributes of them that you see from pot to pot to pot. And that would make complete sense because it looks like he's striking out on his own. He's starting to make this pottery and he's not quick to employ other potters. In time, he's going to kind of pioneer a new decorative style for American stoneware. He's going to take these drapery designs, which they might not pop out to you as drapery or something like that when you look at these at first glance. But what these are is they're taken from designs you see on American furniture and other decorative arts of the time period, where they're a little more obviously like a drapery swag. These are classical designs that date back to antiquity, and that was all the rage at the time. So here's a close-up of one where you see these bellflowers that hang down, bellflower shape, and you see the crescent shape, which is meant to be reminiscent of a drapery swag. The earliest of these that he executes have the early Corlear's hook mark on them. You're going to see quickly he's going to jump to a different maker's marks, but this is a transitional moment where he stops decorating things by hand and he starts stamping everything. Now, you're going to ask yourself, why does he start doing this? Because once he starts doing it, other potters start to do it too. And it ends up influencing a lot of stoneware up and down the East Coast. We don't really have a lot of time to go into that today, but suffice it to say that Commeraw's work was very influential in that sense alone. But it seems to me that, and the historical record does hint at the fact that Commeraw employed people, other African Americans, in his shop. And it seems to me that if you were going to try to bring those people into your shop and give them a job, those people weren't trained to throw pottery on a wheel, which is a years-long apprenticeship and all that sort of thing. They might not have been trained to learn how to bake pots in a kiln, because that was a very technologically advanced thing of its time, something Commeraw had clearly learned to do and had mastered, but they might not know how to do that. But you could put them in a shop and give them these decorations to stamp into clay. And so I can't help but see that might be what's going on here. I showed you that. Now, this is the mark that he becomes famous for, Commeraw's Stoneware, which is basically his brand name. There's different marks that are added onto this. And so that early Corlear's hook mark is just going to go away completely. Probably around, it's pretty apparent that he's using these marks by about 1803, late 1803, but I think he probably switches over around 1800. Here is one of his greatest works known. This is the finest Commeraw jug in existence. It looks great from this angle, but it looks really cool from this angle. So this has all of the marks that that he would use throughout the rest of his career. It says Commeraw's Stoneware and York Corlear's hook. Here are those two jugs that I began the talk with. And here are another couple jugs. Now, these are like more typical production items for him. The ones I've showed you so far are special things. Like these are big jugs that are probably meant to sit in a store window or something and advertise his work. And in fact, the one on the left was recovered in the South, and it was clearly shipped down there, perhaps to a merchant shop who put this work in the window to show off that beautiful New York stoneware that they were selling. As I said, these are more kind of production items, but the one on the left is a particularly fine one that the New York Historical Society owns. Needless to say, I'm not going to show every single example that you could possibly see like this, but he can pick and choose what stamps he's going to use. So some just say Corlear's hook, some just say Commeraw's, some even just say Stoneware. But here are here are two that have 3 lines on them. Commeraw's Stoneware New York. That New York is actually really rare. That's kind of an inside baseball collector thing with this stuff, but the New York's very rare. That's owned by the New York Historical Society. The one on the right is owned by the National Museum for African American History and Culture. And one thing that kind of bowled me over when I found out it happened was, after researching this guy for so long and all of that, in 2016, in the lead up to the opening of the museum in Washington, they had a small exhibition in the Obama White House. And so these two objects along with several others. There weren't that many chosen though, and one chosen was a Commeraw jug, sat in the East Colonnade of the White House. So there's a famous cast of Martin Luther King by Charles Henry Alston. So that Commeraw jug shared space with that iconic object. It's kind of wild. Commeraw also made jars. So the two main jar forms, I showed you these, but here's one with those vertical handles, we call them. That tends to fall away by the early 19th century, and this tends to take over. This is really just like a quintessential Manhattan stoneware jar form. And then you do see other jar forms, straight-sided ones, and these are a little more hodgepodge. You also see pitchers. So the one on the left is owned by Winterthur. The one on the right is one from his early time period. This one just surfaced. It is not marked in any way. And because Commeraw was pretty obsessive about marking his work, I wonder if it was made when he was working down near City Hall before he opened his own shop. But that's a really important thing. I always like to show new discoveries. So that's a new discovery. Commeraw, as I said, was not just a potter. So the fact that Commeraw was a very high level African-American craftsman, by the end of his life nationally known, that in and of itself was a very kind of progressive thing. And even in just the work in the work of Booker T. Washington, in the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, all these writers agreed that the more African-American craftsmen you could have, the better off everyone would be. And so Commeraw, I mean, he nailed that, but he also was an abolitionist, an activist, and all those things, like I said. So in 1807, he founded this thing called the African Society of the City of New York for Improvement. And one of its stated goals, see if I can highlight this, was as far as possible to free others of their brethren from bondage. Now, one thing that's interesting about that, besides the fact that Commeraw was clearly an unabashed abolitionist, was that this organization he created went to the New York State Legislature at the time and attempted to receive a charter to be incorporated. And he really needed that if he wanted to survive. And there were all these groups that would rise and then fall in New York at the time. Some will probably never even know the names of them, that were trying to succeed. But Commeraw had clearly gotten to a point where he was very successful, and he goes to the legislature with this petition, and he's denied, and his group falls away. Now, shortly after that, two other very similar groups did the same thing and got their charters and continued to prosper and all these sorts of things. Well, neither of those groups mentioned abolition in their petitions. And so I can't help but think that's the reason why the legislature shut the door on his organization. Keeping with the theme of abolition, this is a wonderful program for an oration on the abolition of the slave trade. And that was delivered in the African Church in New York City on January 2nd, 1809. The slave trade had been banned. This is the transatlantic slave trade. So it was no longer legal to bring slaves into the United States. And so this was the first anniversary of that important legislation. And you can see here that Commeraw is singing hymns. So we have him directing a hymn, singing a hymn, and then a hymn under the direction of Thomas W. Commeraw. That's a wonderful thing. I was really excited to find when I found it. Here's Commeraw helping someone obtain basically a freedom certificate. So what this is in the 18 teens, a big problem for the Black community in New York City was that new onerous laws had come in, making sure that you had to prove that you were not a slave if you wanted to vote, because it was illegal for slaves to vote. So instead of just assuming that someone who walked in to vote could freely vote, these people would make them prove that they were not enslaved. So you had to go do all this paperwork, pay some money, and get this freedom certificate. So here's Commeraw, and this is actually his signature on this document. This is owned by the New York Historical Society, helping this person, Peter Johnson, get a freedom certificate. This is in 1813. He's chairing a meeting of colored citizens. And he was a big leader in the Republican Party, which was unusual. By the way, that's not Lincoln's Republican Party. This is the Democratic Republican Party. This is the party of Jefferson and Madison and Monroe. It was unusual at the time because Federalists, which were the competing party, they were considered by Blacks to be more in line with trying to help people of African descent. For instance, Alexander Hamilton was a Federalist. The de facto party really of the American craftsmen, though, at the time, so the Crolius family, for instance, these were Democratic Republicans, and that's what Commeraw was. These also happen to be the same people that were putting in a lot of these voter laws. So by the end of Commeraw's life, he appears to reject the Republicans and become an independent. You could still become an independent way back then. We've got, and so you actually can drill down and see the some of the things that were issued from this Republican meeting. You can see what's on these people's minds. You can see that a free and fair exercise of the elective franchise is essentially necessary for the preservation of life, liberty, and property. And then they support Governor Tompkins, who is the incumbent, and that he continues to be the zealous friend of colored people and is in principle and in practice opposed to slavery. Now, during the War of 1812, Blacks, Commeraw included, were completely banned by federal law from serving in American militias. So there was a big fear that the British were going to attack New York City. And the only way that people like Commeraw could participate in that effort was to build fortifications. And he did that. So here's a great advertisement where he's calling together the people of color of the city of New York for a test of patriotism, for them to show that even though things, they had their difficulties, this was a cause worth fighting for and that they should support their country. This is piggybacking off of that. And this is one of my favorite ads I've ever found researching American stoneware. It's apparent from this ad to me that Commeraw, the pottery site was kind of open to the Black community as not only a place of employment, but a place of meeting, whether that's political, whether it's for any reason you can imagine, because this ad actually is calling together the people of color of the city and county of New York. And it's saying the time has come, which affords you an opportunity of contributing your might in erecting a fort on Brooklyn Heights. Now, might there is not M-I-G-H-T, it's M-I-T-E, which is a reference to the widow's mite, the widow who contributed basically her last penny in the New Testament. Contributing your might in erecting a fort on Brooklyn Heights to defend yourselves and your country from the invading redcoats who are so detestable to every lover of his country's rights and freedom. All those patriots who are disposed to render their services will meet on Wednesday evening next by order of the meeting held at Corlear's Hook. Corlear's Hook was a small place. It's clear to me they were meeting at the Pottery site. Commeraw also supported fellow Black business owners. He made these wonderful oyster jars. Every single one of these that you see there, other than the one on the far right, were made for African-American oystermen. You have Daniel Johnson, who was kind of a predecessor to Thomas Downing, if you're familiar with him. Very famous. This guy was very famous in his time for his oysters. You have William Brown, who was an African church founder. And you have George White, who was an evangelist and actually wrote a slave narrative, which he published in 1810. Eventually, Commeraw is going to unfortunately fall on hard times. And the stoneware business was not easy. And this is an all too common story for stoneware potters. He lasted a long time. His pottery was in business for well over 20 years. That is great by stoneware pottery standards. However, he eventually got into all kinds of financial trouble. Here you see a sad statement of them selling at Commeraw's manufactory a quantity of stoneware clay and a horse and cart and a quantity of household furniture. Well, around this time, Commeraw decides that rather than try to pick up the pieces of what's going on financially, he's going to attach himself to something called the colonization movement. This is Paul Cuffey. Some of you might be familiar with him. By one estimation, he was the richest Black man in America during his lifetime. He was a whaling captain out of Massachusetts, and he eventually kind of gave in to the entreaties of well-known British abolitionists, white abolitionists, to help them bring American Blacks to the west coast of Africa under a plan that, and this version was well-intentioned. This plan was to, if you could take a Western industry, education, religion, all those things to Africa, you could turn it into something like a United States of Africa, run and populated by Blacks, and that this could be like a panacea for Blacks worldwide. So Cuffey is agreeable to this. He does take some people over there, but he dies in 1817. And once he dies, that movement kind of gets co-opted by more racist forces. So the American Colonization Society is founded in 1817, and it's founded by some of the highest reaches of American society. Their chief founder was Bushrod Washington, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the nephew of George Washington. Henry Clay was involved with this, Andrew Jackson, a lot of really famous American historical figures, and they actually met on the floor of the House of Representatives at times. So this was almost a government institution. This took as its premise something like what I just described, but really there was a huge thread through the ACS of plain and simply trying to deport American Blacks because it was an answer to the problem of slavery and free Blacks and what to do with this situation. Commeraw himself gets sucked into this movement. Now, Commeraw, there's lots of reasons why we could talk about why he might do this. Obviously, he had financial trouble, but it seemed, and you know, he was a Christian, so definitely like the evangelistic side of this, that was a big part of this project, and that might have attracted him. But frankly, I really think, and you're going to see in a minute, someone kind of verify this, that in the end, I think Commeraw realized there really was only so far he could go in America. He'd kind of gotten there, he put the financial trouble aside, but he could never be a governor, a senator, a president. And that's what a lot of these people were hoping to be in Africa. I think that was part of it. But another part of it too is there is like this patriotic thing with Commeraw, and he seems to kind of wear it as a badge of honor that he's being sent there by the federal government, because not to get into the real nuts and bolts of this, but basically initially the federal government is sending these people over, and they pick Commeraw because he's a stoneware manufacturer. But eventually, if the colony can get stable enough, it will, the ACS will then administer the colony. And really the way this is all being done is under the auspices, or just under the idea that America needs a place to put people who are rescued off of slave ships. As I had mentioned, they had banned the transatlantic slave trade. So they will, when they free these people off of boats, they don't have anywhere to put them. So if they make this colony, that's another bonus of all this, actually the main driving force for why the federal government is involved. This is a pot that you can see is made a lot more primitively than what Commeraw was making. This is basically an earthenware, and it is being fired basically on the ground. People are still doing this in Africa. You can see it on the left there, that is a depiction of a Crolius family kiln. So that's what Commeraw is trying to bring to Africa. He unfortunately never succeeds in doing that. This letter was something I found in the archives of the New York Historical Society, and this was extremely gratifying to find. for one, it tells us where Commeraw went to church. Commeraw, we saw he went to Trinity Church, which is an Episcopal assembly. But by the time he gets kind of a footing with his family and starts his own shop and everything, he starts going to this place called St. Stephen's on the Bowery. And that is also an Episcopal assembly. We don't have time to get into this today, but when you're trying to think about this person and the life he lived, that was an inextricable part of his life. Every day he said certain prayers. You know, he ordered his life around his church life. And this was his pastor, a white pastor. And also Commeraw did not go to, as far as I can tell, he never regularly attended a strictly African church, as they called them. He went to a regular church that was integrated, just an integrated church on the Bowery. Anyway, this is written by his pastor, Henry Feltus. It says that Thomas Commeraw is a colored man of strong mind and general information. This was written, I believe, in 1821, by the way. It says he was a member of St. Stephen's Church and much respected for many years, and had a pottery for Corlear's Hook, where he decently supported a large family. He got in his head, however, that he was going to be a great man in this new colony, and nothing could dissuade him from selling off his property and going with his family to Africa. That seems to strike at one of the main reasons why Commeraw left. This is an emigration register. The ship was called the ship Elizabeth, and it left New York Harbor in early 1820. This is his family on that register. You can see him listed as a 45-year-old potter. That age is slightly incorrect, but they usually rounded, weren't really trying to be super accurate here. There's his wife, Anne, his second wife, Mary Rowe, that I talked about earlier. She had died of dysentery in 1813. He has a son, William, who's 19, and that would be by Mary. And then he has two by Anne. Thomas Commeraw Jr., he's called here. His name is Thomas Henry Commeraw. And then there's little Anne Commeraw. They leave New York and they go to Sierra Leone. On the way, Commeraw is basically made a leader of this expedition. He is part of a three-man civil authority. You can see there that it consists of Messrs. Coker of Baltimore, Commeraw of New York, and Hall of Philadelphia. Coker was perhaps the most famous African-American on that boat. He was a man of mixed race from Baltimore and a reverend. Commeraw and he have a huge falling out. And that's a long litany, a sad story. But Commeraw accused Coker of doing very terrible things while he was in Africa. And it really causes Commeraw to have to detach himself from this project. I'm going to get to that in a second. They arrive here at Freetown. This is I think a couple decades before they arrived, but it would have looked something like this when they got there. The spot they're going, so up here, that star up at the top, that is Freetown. So that is Sierra Leone. That place is still there. Where they're going is down the coast to this place, Sherbro Island. And they think that they can use this as a staging ground to buy land, maybe on the mainland, and start their colony. This is what Sherbro Island looks like today. And this is probably about what that town that he ended up landing at Sherbro Island would have looked like. It was not a nice place to live. It was very muddy, very dirty, and unfortunately, everybody gets sick. The vast majority of the party gets malaria. Commeraw probably gets it himself at some point. His wife, Anne, dies of malaria. His children all get sick. He has this falling out with Coker that I alluded to. And eventually he's kind of in exile on this island, away from the rest of the colonists, until he returns to America in 1822. But and I'm going to close with what happens to him in Baltimore. But there are some instances where we get Commeraw, we're able to let Commeraw speak for himself. And I always think it's a great opportunity we should take. Enables us to kind of get into his headspace and all that kind of thing. So I'm going to close with some of his writings, and then I'm going to tell you what happened to him. This is a letter, a letter that Commeraw wrote in Africa. It was not authored by him in the sense that it was attributed to the person that was kind of his host at Sherbro Island. He hosted all of these people. And when this falling out happened, there was a lot of terrible stuff written in the newspapers in America about what transpired. So they wrote this letter to try to vindicate themselves. And Commeraw, this handwriting matches Commeraw's own handwriting. And in fact, you can see this at the top there. There's that word Thomas W. Commeraw. That's the exact same signature he used on that document I showed to you earlier. So he's basically acting as this guy's scribe, but he's giving input about what happened in Africa. So I'm just going to read this. The 4th of July, 1820, Thomas W. Commeraw sent to Captain Martin of the schooner Augusta, informing him that the Augusta was a United States vessel, and on such a day, pointing out to him the day would be the 4th of July, requested that if there was as much powder on board at sunrise, to fire a salute, and if there was not powder to fire a salute, to hoist the flag at sunrise. The answer from Mr. Martin was this, that he could not without your consent. This he tried to obtain, but it was in vain. You said that you would not have it done. Now, this is to Coker. You said that you would not have it done, for the independence of the United States was nothing to you, and that you disregarded her flag. The implication being that Commeraw regarded her flag. It's just an interesting to get into his head. Here's another one. First thing you did was to mislead the people in their distresses, men, women, and children almost naked. You said to them, if you want clothes, subscribe your names to the Colonization Society and leave the service of the United States. To this, Commeraw objected. This, he said, would be desertion and treachery, and that he knew nothing about the Colonization Society. You told him that the white agents had given all the people over to the Colonization Society. The answer of Mr. Commeraw was this to you, that neither could show a right given to them from him to barter or to turn over his life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness without his consent. He said that he came out a mechanic, which is a craftsman and artisan, in the United States service and would be that or nothing. Commeraw actually wrote letters back to America that were published in national newspapers. This is a letter I found just randomly on eBay on Christmas Eve 2006. This was the first piece of evidence I found that he had gone to Africa, and this really broke down all brick walls for me in my research as I tried to put this man's life back together. But I think it's worth reading the majority of this. He says, "Sir, I embrace this opportunity to inform you of what will be the ultimate of colonization of us free people of color on the western coast of Africa. I have been in this country at this date better than 12 months, and in looking around me for improvement for a colony, I find none that is probable. For in the first place, the natives are all heathen. They have the balance of power. Their example takes with us, and their manners. We seem to have lost all that is praiseworthy. I had a hope that we had some stability, but we have none. Whatever might have been the primitive causes committed by our forefathers that caused the Almighty to pass his judgments upon them, I dare not pretend to say. But I would take my chance of being carried away and sold, conformable to the judgment, than to remain here a heathen. Glory to God in the highest that I was born in a Christian land, and I will follow my Christian profession until my life's end, which will soon be, for I am old. But I mourn the situation of my children, should I leave them behind me. Unable to get away from this place, they will have to bow to heathen customs, their children likely to become heathen themselves. I've lost the principal part of my family, my wife and niece. In this country, the climate is favorable to slothfulness and sickness. Its soil is poor, generally bad water. Its wildfowl all poor, fish scarce. In fact, the country and people poor. I was told by the agents of the Colonization Society that the society intended to support the colony 8 or 10 years. By that time, the colony would be able to help and defend themselves. I wish I could think so. I am informed that the government of the United States, agreeable with their constitution, cannot have a colony out of their jurisdiction. If this be the case, the society in less than 30 years will leave the colony. The cost will be too great. What will follow? Lives lost, money spent, and the people turned in with the heathen." Thomas Commeraw returns to Baltimore sometime in 1822. And he unfortunately dies about maybe a year later. He probably was, he probably either died directly of malaria or from some complication having to do with malaria. Here it says he's about 56 years. I don't think that's the historical record seems to clarify that it's more like 52. But anyway, I'll read his obituary, which was published in papers up and down the East Coast. Yesterday morning, Thomas W. Commeraw, aged 56 years. He was a descendant of Africa and for many years carried on an extensive business in New York, where he was very generally known. He, among others, left this country for Sierra Leone, Africa, and after remaining there some time, returned to Baltimore. So this is a sad story. In the end, it's almost a Shakespearean tragedy. But again, I just really hope that as you kind of let all this sink in, I know it's a lot of material, that you're at least as fascinated by the fact that his story just kind of completely slipped through the fingers of history. And it is gratifying to see that that's starting to be corrected.
All right. That was great, Grant. Very much appreciated and very in-depth. I have actually a quick question. Do you know why he went back to Baltimore instead of coming back to New York?
It's a great question. That's where the ship was going. It was hard for him to get back out of Africa. And so, hold on, I'm just gonna, there we go. It was hard for him to like find a ship to talk somebody in him back. And there was a ship coming back with some other colonists that were leaving. And in the newspaper, it said they were leaving to bring their families back to Africa, but that didn't really happen because it was pretty bad over there.
Right.
So he stayed in Baltimore though, and there's some evidence that his family continued to stay there for some time, but then they went up and settled in Hartford, Connecticut. In Baltimore, if he wasn't completely sick during that rough year that he lived there, he was probably working in the stoneware potteries that were there. It had a very rich stoneware craft there, and that Henry Remy had come down, who he had worked with in New York. So it seems to me natural that he would get employed in those shops.
All right. We do have a few questions from the chat. The first one from Stephen. He says, as a potter, teacher, and collector, I'm very sensitive to value versus cost as perhaps related, but very distinct descriptions. And what would your thoughts on that idea be, value versus cost?
Value versus cost of, does he mean like so I think
of pottery. You were talking sort of in the earlier parts about
monetary value.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think what he's saying is that in one way we could
if I can
define
just step in and explain a little more.
Yeah, do it. I think I know what you're saying, but go ahead. Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so I'm also a writer, and I'm as I said in my question, I'm very, very sensitive when somebody labels something in a cost, in a valuing something in monetary terms versus the value of something historically, culturally, heritage-wise,
Right.
and so on and so forth, and what an object means to an individual versus what it might cost.
Yeah, so I've given a number of talks on Commeraw, and I've never talked about what we'll call cost in those talks, because to me, the story is priceless. And what we're supposed to take away from that story, all those things, those are priceless. At the same time, these things are sold, and there tends to be almost like a feedback loop between cost and attention. So, for instance, there was a wonderful exhibition that's still going on that started at the Met called Hear Me Now, which was an exhibition of the works of David Drake, the enslaved African-American potter of Edgefield, South Carolina, and other Black potters of Edgefield, South Carolina. Part of the reason why that exhibition happened is because that stuff has, we'll call it, cost attached to it. And so there is, as I say, the simplest way to put this is that the cost tends to amplify attention, which can bring very good things from that attention. We're also in a culture where like Antiques Roadshow is still an extremely, it's still consumed a lot. And so sometimes people just like to know, they have no idea, you know, Commeraw's, like I mentioned, the world record for Commeraw's work is 120,000. That same pot sold many, many years ago for under 30,000. But that's in part the stoneware market in general is just very strong right now. But where I'm going with that is Commeraw's work can also be had for far, 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 far less than that. If you're interested in that at all, not all of it is like out of reach financially. You know, there are examples that could be found for under $1,000 if they have damage, things like that. But again, like this story, the time I put into it and stuff, that had nothing to do with cost. It had nothing to do with money. Selling books is not lucrative unless you're in a certain niche and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I get what you're saying. And I hope that answers your question.
It does. And I'm glad you clarified it for everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome.
Next question from Timo. Why did nobody think he was Black?
Yeah, so there was a book written in, actually there's a great book called Modern Negro Art by a man named James Porter, who was a professor at Howard University. And in that book, it's about modern art. And this came out in, I think, the 50s. And he, even though it's about modern art, he talks about how he happened to be African-American. He and other friends of his basically were trying to locate lost works by identified African-American craftsmen. But he said the mantra, one thing that spurred him on was the mantra that American Blacks had no, as he put it, pictorial or plastic art. Plastic art means ceramic art, sculpture, things like that. So that was just generally understood that there shouldn't be someone of Commeraw's race running a shop like that in the thick of New York City during the federal era. There was also, if you want to be very stoneware specific, there was a book that came out around the turn of the 20th century that was one of the first that tried to was the first that really tried to put stoneware on the map as something that should be collected, studied, all those sorts of things. And the only reference in that book to any kind of African-American potters was of ones, I mentioned this exhibition called Hear Me Now that talked about that displayed the works of these African-American potters from Edgefield, South Carolina. He talks about potters in Edgefield, South Carolina, but he describes them only as making, I think he called it weird looking pottery, which are these face jugs that some of the people out there might be familiar with. But his description of them is nowhere near, like, there's not even a hint that someone could have been such a high level craftsman that they could own a shop in New York City and all those sorts of things. So that, I think the default was always, if you're going to see a jug like that, it had to have been made by a white person. They would have to be hit over the head with the fact, which is what ended up happening more or less, that he was Black for that to be an entertained thought. Ironically, Commeraw is probably an African name. So he's kind of telling us right there on the jugs, but people didn't get the message. Oh, I think you're muted, maybe?
Sorry about that. Sorry. Next question is from HM. What happened to your planned research on the other potter, Henry Remy, that originally drew you to researching potters in New
Okay,
York?
so that's a great question. So my brother actually published, we were both at Johns Hopkins around the same time, and he was in the history department. And he wrote a thesis on Baltimore stoneware. And that was one of the reasons why I was so interested in this stuff at the time. For those of you who don't know my story, my dad bought a stoneware crock in the late 70s when I was a baby for $8. And he quickly became kind of obsessed with American stoneware. By the early 80s, he was selling it on a regular basis. And in 1990, he actually quit his job as a pretty high-level hospital administrator to basically sell stoneware full-time. That morphed into our auction company. But at the time, he was just buying and selling these things. And my brothers and I would go to these shows constantly. And we just learned so much about stoneware without even realizing we had. And so we came to really care about stoneware, and we came to realize when things hadn't been researched properly and stuff. So we would always try to fill in gaps and stuff. And that happened around this time that I was talking about. So he had written this thesis, and he was doing a lot of work on Henry Remy in Baltimore. And I wanted to find more about him in New York. I never found a great deal about him in New York. His main story is in Baltimore, but he eventually published an article in Ceramics in America, which is the journal of record for historic American ceramics. And you can find that online. If you search Henry Remy and Luke Zipp, you can read about it. And it's a cool story. Henry Remy actually had to leave New York because he fell in really hard financial times. And a lot of that's explained in that article and stuff.
Thank you. Jack would like to know, where here did potters get their cobalt, and would it have been used in other manufacturing processes?
That is a great question that I don't know the answer to. I have a vague memory that they're getting it imported. I don't think there were cobalt mines in America, but I'm not sure about that. The production and sourcing of stuff like clays, I know a fair amount about clay. I don't know about cobalt. And I think they would have been using cobalt to make glass too. But I wish I had a great answer for you.
Okay. Do you know if it was a stain or a glaze? That was another question.
So what they call it is, they call it a slip. And what that basically is a little bit of clay, a little bit of water, and the mineral itself. You mix it up. When it goes on there, like the swag you can see back here, that would have been just like a gray color. And then when the salt hits it and it comes out and everything, it's that great blue. Now, not always like that. And that's on all potters' work, but that's true for all potters, but it's also true for Commeraw, that sometimes it came out like a black color. And that has to do with different conditions. It's the firing, how it was mixed, all those things.
Thank you.
Yep.
The maker's mark that Commeraw used in pottery, was it a stamp, incised, or both?
Maker's mark is always a stamp. So that's a great question, though, about how that stamp was constructed, what it was made out of. Some of the ones on the oyster jars, for instance, look a little more like proper type you might buy from like metal type. But so I could talk about this a long time, but the backwards lettering that you see on his work, you can't just buy, for instance, an S and then flip it around and have it, if it's on a backing, you can only turn it this way and it will still look like an S. So to get a backwards S, that's like a feat. We don't know how he did that. It is not intentional. So for instance, I showed you those jugs, the one behind me, and then those other two. They clearly were all made around the same time because they all look very similar, particularly the other two. But they all have that N York on them. But the N York, again, this is kind of inside baseball, is different than all the other N Yorks I've ever seen on his work. It has a backwards N, and the type is actually distinct. It's different than the other N York. And it seems to me that when he got these new stamps that say Commeraw, Stoneware, and all that, one of them had the backwards N, and he said, well, I don't want this because it has the backwards N, and he went back to his old one. But I don't know how these stamps were made. I don't know if he bought them from someone who just did a poor job of making them, or if he made them himself. And I'm tending to lean more toward he made them himself, and he might have even made them out of clay.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, as a potter myself, I make stamps, and that's the easiest way to do it. So it makes sense.
That's great to hear. Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. Do you know what was discovered this year in the Corlear's archaeological dig?
Oh, I don't know. I I don't think that's been released. I had some communication about that several months ago, but I have not heard yet if they found anything. From my understanding of the progression of that area and everything that was built and everything, if they found anything there, which I think there's a good chance they may have Commeraw related, it would be very tiny little fragments that wouldn't really tell us much, but would still be really cool to find. But what happened was, for those of you who don't know, I showed you that picture of the pot outside that building where the pottery was. That is now public housing. Across the street is the park, and they just did a big archaeological dig there. I think it's completed and all that.
Jill says, based on your knowledge, who were his customers aside from the oystermen? How did he sell his stoneware? And did his customers know he was a Black craftsman?
Yeah. So one thing I said once, I think this is in the book, is I think that very often people were buying stoneware from him that had no idea what his race was, because it's hard to think back or try to imagine that time. But that was a time where, if you're in New York, which is a major port city, you are constantly putting things on ships, and they're going, up and down the Eastern Seaboard. I actually recently saw an ad where they were selling New York stoneware in Kinderhook. So they're in Columbia County. Obviously they would be, but this was an ad that specifically said, we have New York stoneware here, because these merchants were always quick to advertise that that they were handling New York stoneware. So I talked about lead glazed earthenware. That was a common thing in America. In a similar way, you'll see ads all over the country for Philadelphia earthenware, because Philadelphia was the big center for that. So you see these sorts of ads all the way down, like Charleston, for instance, was getting tons of New York stoneware. The way this was sold, as I understand it, and it's something that's fascinated me for a while that I've never been able to, it's still like kind of questionable how all this was done, but it seemed to me that you definitely, the ads hint at the fact you could go to the pottery and just buy these vessels. You could buy a few, you could buy a lot, whatever. You could also be a merchant and buy it or work out some other arrangement and sell it in your shop. And that seems to be the primary way this stuff was sold. But a huge way this stuff was sold was as a secondary product. So it wasn't just like, hey, I'm going to go into John Smith's merchant shop and buy a bunch of jugs. I'm going to go in, I'm going to buy a bunch of liquor. And now I have a bunch of jugs that say Commeraw stoneware on them. And in fact, I didn't feel like I had time to show this, but in time you'll start to see, this didn't happen at this time, but in time you start to see jugs that actually have the names of the merchants on them, because they'll go to the pottery and they'll say, look, don't put your name on it. I don't want it to say Commeraw stoneware. I want to say whatever. Well, Commeraw actually made the very first one of those that we have. It was made in the first decade of the 19th century. It's definitely a Commeraw object, has the same kind of lettering, same kind of stamps, and it says Ashmore's Genuine Cordials prepared by W. Field only. And Anne Ashmore was a female owner of this shop, this cordial distillery, and this man, William Field, who ended up marrying her, she was a widow, was making the cordials. But that jug, for instance, that was not purchased as a primary product. Someone, who knows what kind of cordials they were, they probably tasted pretty good, but that jug that has survived all this time was purchased as a secondary product.
Wow. Early wholesaling. Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Dave says, don't want to distract from this discussion about Commeraw, but an ancestor of Dave's established the first commercial pottery in Massachusetts. His name was Seaver, and the pottery was in Taunton. Do you know of any source of information about Seaver and Taunton and his work?
Well, there's a book by Laura Woodside Watkins. It's called Early New England Potters and Their Wares. And that has some info about Seaver in there. That's the one I have done a little bit on that. And I think that's the one I've always looked in when I've wanted to like get started. Feel free to email me. If you go to commeraw.com, there's a contact form. Email me if you have some questions. I could give you some, if you're trying to research him, I could give you some advice.
Excellent. That's a good resource. Dave's going to be emailing you for sure. HM says, are there any business records of any potters of the late 18th, early 19th century that might show sources of supplies, perhaps some of the cost of material or prices charged?
Yeah,
any information
so
like that?
just one example, there are like, you have to get lucky that they have to be in a historical society somewhere. Like just back to my brother and the research he's done in Baltimore Stoneware, there was a pottery in Baltimore that kept all their records. And that was great because not only were we able to see stuff like you said, we were able to identify certain potters in the shop, which really helped. And we were even able to identify, so like this was a time period where these potters weren't marking their work, but they were making the advertising pieces that I described and just plain pieces with decorations. And we were able, based on customers listed in their workbooks and everything, to look for pieces that had their advertising on it. And then we were able to figure out what they were actually making at these potteries. So that was kind of fun.
Excellent. All right. So we're getting a little close on time. So I'm going to kind of combine the last two questions from Roger and Jack. So how many pieces per week would a pottery like his produce? And how many people would he have employed? Do we know for certain that that Commeraw decorated his own work, or it wasn't done by his employees? Because traditionally German stoneware was decorated by women and girls.
So later on, I think certainly like I said, I think he was hiring people who were not necessarily skilled to decorate it with the stamps. The incised ones that I showed you, every single one I've ever seen was clearly decorated by the exact same person. So I just assume that that's Commeraw, especially because he's come from another shop where they're making stuff decorated similarly. There is evidence in American stoneware that men frequently decorated. There are specific decorators we've identified, especially from later on, that traveled from pottery to pottery, and you can kind of follow them and you'll see the same hand making, like, say, a deer or a bird. But so for the later stuff, the stamp stuff, I say yes, absolutely. It could have been women, it could have been anybody. For the early stuff, I think it's probably Commeraw that did that himself. I think that the evidence suggests that. What was the first question again?
How many pieces per week would?
Oh yeah, so it's really hard. It's really hard to say. I mean, just from doing this so long, you see people who were, say, like in business the same amount of time as another person, but yet we have way more work from this person still around than this person. And I can only assume that that's because this person was making way more of it. So it's really hard to ballpark. I don't know. And then there's also potters. Now, Commeraw wouldn't have been one of these people, but like there's potters that made things seasonally because they were primarily a farmer, for instance. And then in the winter, they'd be a potter. So then like, it's very hard to, the best source for that, if you're really interested in it, is there were these things called censuses of manufacturers, which instead of like the censuses I showed you, this was them going to different businesses and asking them questions about their manufacturing. And it will have lists of how many gallons, for instance, they produced in a certain year. And it can vary wildly from pottery to pottery. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to actually throw in one last question. How many pieces of Commeraw's pottery have been documented? How many do you think are out there?
Yeah, so I've thought about trying to count them, but new ones pop up all the time, and it's kind of hard to to do that because like I did my study with my book, but like that's only part of the picture. I kind of like to say it's best to kind of count the number that are out there in terms of dozens versus hundreds. Like there's a lot, but it's not a lot. And for the early stuff, the Corlear's hook, there's maybe like 15 of those known. It's when you get into the more production level stuff with the stamps that there's more. So a couple hundred, maybe, I don't know. It's really tough to say.
Wow, it'd be interesting to know. So that is the end of our question period. And thank you all for those questions. Really stimulated a lot of other things, which was great. As we close today, I would like to first of all thank Brandt very much. This was a really interesting and clearly engaging talk. We look forward to learning even more about Commeraw. I'd like to thank our co-sponsor, Studio Potter. This has been a great collaboration between our two organizations, and it really fell right in the sweet spot between what we each do. And so thank you for working with us on this. And I think it was really great. I'd also like to give a shout out to Rue, who is our tech guy, without whom none of this would be happening. Rue does basically everything. So big round of applause for Rue. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. I hope you've learned some things and had some fun and enjoyed it. I'd like to thank you on behalf of Studio Potter and on behalf of the archive. Thank you for your continued support of our programs and of our organizations, and have a good rest of your afternoon. Thank you.